I want to talk about an almost 250-year history that we have of identifying and then confronting fairly big challenges around the world. And to do that, one of the things they teach you in presenter school is that when you're talking to the immediate post-lunch crowd, audience participation is extraordinarily important. So we're going to start with the pop quiz. Who's this guy? Our first big pessimist. Real worrier. There we go. This is the Reverend Thomas Malthus, who identified the first of these huge planetary challenges. He said essentially, most of us are going to starve, and there's nothing we can do about it. He was a very upbeat guy. He gives us the adjective Malthusian, which is usually used as an insult, because he said essentially in an essay written at the end of the 18th century, he said, hey, do the math. This is really straightforward. We humans increase our numbers at an exponential rate. 1, 2, 4, 8, 16. Our ability to grow food, to nourish everybody, our ability to take resources, take nourishment from the earth, only increases at a linear rate. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You do the math, that does not come out very well. And what he was essentially saying is, look, you can have a high population, most of them are going to starve. You can have a very low population who are comparatively well off, but you absolutely can't have both. And the reason his name is an adjective that's an insult, as we'll see, is because he was pretty wrong. He was lousy as a forecaster. Malthus was actually a pretty good historian without even knowing that. So I want to show you how right Malthus was for hundreds of years. I want to draw a graph that the economic historian Gregory Clark drew that shows the state of English prosperity and population over hundreds of years, right up until Malthus wrote his essay. And what we're going to do is put the population of the country on the horizontal axis. We're going to put a decent measure of prosperity, how well was the average person doing, on the vertical axis, and then let's watch what happens century by century. If both our population and our prosperity are increasing, we're going to zoom off and up to the right here. If we're on this unpleasant Malthusian pendulum, we're going to swing back and forth between the top left and the lower right here. So let's see what actually happens. Here are the 1200s in England. Here are the 1300s in England. Here are the 1400s. Here are the 1500s. Here are the 1600s. This is an incredibly gloomy, dire Malthusian world. Things got a little bit better in the 1700s because of some improved agricultural abilities. But look at this. All throughout the 1700s, the average Briton was worse off than in the year 1200. This is a picture of stasis, of this kind of gloomy Malthusian oscillation back and forth between two states. This is no fun at all. And then this guy came along. Here's pop quiz number 2. Anyone? Instead of a writer, an inventor who took us out of Malthus's world forever. This is James Watt. This is the guy who gave us the steam engine. This is the person whose invention was instrumental at ushering in the Industrial Revolution. And we hear a lot about the Industrial Revolution. We don't hear enough about it. It is impossible to overstate how big a deal the Industrial Revolution was. To show that, to try to give some idea of how big a change this was, I want to keep drawing that same graph. And I want to add 2 more centuries worth of data to it. So here's our graph. To keep drawing the graph, though, we have to take all the data that we've already looked at. And by the way, can you imagine an MIT conference where every time someone says data, you have to drink? Right? We would not come back from lunch. Let's take all the data we've already looked at. We have to shrink it down to this tiny little corner of the graph, because this is what the 1800s look like in England. And this is what the 1900s look like in England. The country took off on a trajectory that had never, ever been seen before. Nothing like this had ever happened. And we left Malthus's world and Malthus's predictions in this gloomy, dark corner of the past. When your population is growing and the average person just keeps getting better off, this is exactly the same thing as saying that your economy starts growing by leaps and bounds. So let's look at real English GDP, again, over that same period of time, and you see a story of nothing happening for hundreds of years. The Industrial Revolution changes everything comparatively in the blink of an eye. This is not just an English story, not just a UK story. The world went through a similar transformation at about this time. This is, by any objective, any data-driven standard, this is the biggest story in human history. And Malthus was originally worried about our ability to feed ourselves. Let's look at how good a job we've been doing at feeding ourselves over recent decades. This is food availability by region around the world. And then the global average is that green line there. Look what's been happening. Steady increase in recent decades in our ability to provide people with enough calories. In 1980, that green line was below 2,500 calories. The average person in the world didn't have access to 2,500 calories a day. That's kind of an important benchmark because that's essentially the number of calories necessary to keep an active adult male at the same body weight. The average person in the world wasn't there in 1980. Every region of the world is now above that standard. This is a profound transformation in human well-being. So we don't need to have that Malthusian worry anymore, and the reason his name has become an adjective for both gloomy and dead flat wrong, and the reason this worry needs to fade into the background is because the Industrial Revolution happened, the Industrial Age happened. Our ability to take energy, take resources from the earth, flipped on its head, and that scarcity no longer became an issue. In fact, the world changed so much that we started to come up with a different problem, the inverse of the Malthusian problem. Malthusian problem was we can't scratch enough resources from the world to have a decent standard of living. Around the time of the first Earth Day in 1970, we started to worry about exactly the reverse problem, which is that we've become so successful at taking resources from the earth that we're going to take all of them. We're actually going to use up, we're going to deplete our planet. And if you looked at the evidence, if you looked at some of the trends around Earth Day, the original Earth Day in 1970, you would find a lot of support for this gloomy resource shortage-based view of the world. Let's switch from England to America, because we have a very good data here, and look at 170 years of real GDP in the United States, the size of the American economy. And you just see steady exponential growth. This is what a graph looks like of pretty steady exponential growth. That's great news for population and prosperity. Where this becomes challenging is when we start to overlay on this exact same graph our resource consumption. Everyone here knows economies need energy to run. Let's look at energy use year by year for 170 years. The two lines are almost indistinguishable. Our energy use went up one for one, year after year, throughout the entire industrial period up to the time of the first Earth Day. If we zoom in on the 20th century, let's look at 70 years, from 1900 to 1970, we see the same story with some other pretty important resources. Our use of metals, the backbone of an economy. We just needed more of them at an exponential rate year after year. Our use of fertilizers, the thing that prepares the ground so we can take more food from it every year, that was going up at a very steady exponential clip as well. I could keep drawing these kinds of graphs, and they all tell the same story. Our economy, our population, our prosperity were growing. That's great. We were using up more of the Earth's resources at that exact same exponential rate. You project those lines going into the future, you start to think about billions of additional people having higher standards of living, wanting to consume more, using up more and more resources, and you can come to some pretty pessimistic conclusions. Some of us, I think a few people in the room were around for the first Earth Day, and you remember the tone of the discussion back then was pretty gloomy because we thought we were going to strip the Earth bare. There are a number of books written about this, and I am not sure that last one needs an exclamation point in the title. I find that a little bit of overkill. But the dominant discussion was this worried Again, very gloomy discussion. Not that we couldn't take enough, but that we would take everything until there wasn't enough Earth left. We were just going to deplete the Earth, and then things don't look pretty good for us. Part of solving problems is going back to their root cause. And a lot of the discussion around the time of the first Earth Day was identifying what we thought that root cause was, which was our economy, which was our growth rate, which was the steady increase in our GDP. So the degrowth movement cropped up, which essentially said, guys, if we want to stop using the resources, we have to reverse course on that main green line, the size of the overall economy in the US and around the world. We cannot keep doing this. Flattening out won't even be enough of a solution. We actually have to decrease that big, thick green line there, because the only sustainable growth out there in the world is degrowth. We have to achieve negative economic growth. I want to make one point really, really clear. We did not do this. We did not embrace degrowth as an economy, as a society. To see that, let's just keep drawing the GDP line forward from 1970. That's what it looks like. You really have trouble seeing that Americans renounced consumption and turned their backs on a higher standard of living or prosperity. We didn't all become Buddhist monks. We didn't all Marie Kondo our lives starting in 1970. We just kind of kept increasing our affluence and growing our economy. So this looks like it could be a real problem. Something deeply weird happened in the year since 1970. Something that was not really anticipated. I couldn't find almost anybody anticipating this trend. And to show the trend, to show this weird and wonderful thing that happened, I want to go back and dive in on a particular industry to show an example of the phenomenon that I'm talking about. Let's look at American agriculture and look what's happened in the years before and since Earth Day. This is a graph of the total tonnage. If you weighed all the crops in America year by year, this is what the line would look like over time. The U.S. is an agricultural powerhouse. We have been, we continue to be. Every non-recession year, our total crop tonnage keeps going up. That's not the weird part. The weird part comes when you look at all of the physical, the material, the resource inputs to agriculture. Because something pretty strange starts to happen. They used to be going up in lockstep with output, in lockstep with that green line, and now they reversed course. Our total fertilizer use has been holding steady or going down. The total amount of water that we use for agriculture has been slowly and steadily decreasing after going up in lockstep with crop tonnage for a while. And the raw amount of land, the raw number of acres that we need to generate all that crop tonnage is going down as well. That crop acreage line looks really, really flat. There's a very shallow decrease there. Don't let that fool you. The magnitude is still huge. Since 1982, we have given an amount of land back to nature from cropland equal in size to the state of Washington. This is a profound reversal. We've just given that land back to nature because we don't need to farm it anymore to generate all those crops. I want to blow up a little bit from agriculture and look at the economy as a whole. Here's our GDP line again. And let's look at a few different resources that we use to generate an economy. Everyone here knows that in addition to energy, economies run on paperwork. So let's look at the total amount of paper used year by year in America. We see the same phenomenon. Used to be going up in lockstep, then it plateaued. And then look what's been happening in the smartphone era. Our total use, this is not per capita, this is not per person use of paper. This is total, all Americans put together consumption of paper has been dropping off a cliff since the end of the Great Recession, the start of the smartphone era over the past decade. We see the same with every other product that we take from trees. This is deceptive. I go home and look at the number of Amazon cardboard packages outside my door and think that we must be deforesting America at an unprecedented clip. We're actually not. The reverse is happening here. I want to show you the same pattern for metals. And before I do that, I want to head off one possible question. Whenever you talk about metals use, somebody says, yeah, but any trend you show is just due to the fact that we've outsourced all of our manufacturing to China. First of all, we need to be clear, we have not outsourced all of our manufacturing to China. We have outsourced some, absolutely. But look at total American manufacturing output. We are, in addition to an agricultural powerhouse, we're a manufacturing powerhouse. Our output has been going up just about every non-recession year. So we need to go away with that myth that we've just taken all of our production and put it offshore. That's not what we've done. However, let's look at what we've done with consumption. Again, not per person, but by all of us put together, consumption of metals year by year in America. You see the same profound decoupling here. Our use of metals used to go up in lockstep with industrial growth, economic growth, and now there's been this pretty profound decoupling. By the way, I want triple extra credit for trying to make the lines corresponding to each metal the same color as the metals themselves. If that doesn't merit some, thank you very much. This brings up kind of an important question. How did we do this? We didn't embrace degrowth. We haven't renounced consumption at all. So why this decoupling? Why are all these lines now changing shape? Before I show you that, let me go one more level back to the main input to an economy, which is energy. This is what we were doing up until 1970. The lines are indistinguishable. Look what's been happening since 1970. Again, we flattened out. Total American energy use is about 0.25% bigger than it was 10 years ago, while the economy has grown by 25%. A deep decoupling of the most fundamental input to an economy, energy. If we look at the main bad side effect of energy, which is greenhouse gas generation, we are actually past peak in America with our greenhouse gases. And again, just so we don't even have to deal with this objection, that red line takes into account the greenhouse gases embedded in everything that we import into the country. So even after we take globalization into account, we are still now on a downward trend with total greenhouse gas emissions. I want to be clear, they're not going down quickly enough. In America or anywhere else in the world, we have a problem here, but we need to not kid ourselves. We have changed our trend line pretty profoundly here. So the question is, how did we pull this amazing feat off? And to get an answer to this, I'm sorry, there's the emissions line. To get an answer to this, we have to go to the obvious spot, which is a Radio Shack ad from 1991. This is absolutely a true story. There's a retired newsman whose idea of a good time is to go to yard sales in his hometown of Buffalo and buy stuff that might teach him something about his city's history. And he saw at a yard sale a stack of Buffalo News newspapers from 1991. And he had to have them, right? So he paid $5 and took them home. He was flipping through them, and he came across a Radio Shack ad, this ad from 1991. And he had a really interesting observation. He said there are 15 items on this page. 13 of them have vanished into your smartphone. We just don't walk around. Look at the size of that camcorder. Do you see that thing? That's gone. Your tape recorder, your Walkman, your answering machine, your fax machine, your police scan, all these things. Is there a calculator on here? Yeah, way up top. All these have vanished right down into your smartphone. I love this. It's just this beautiful example of what I think is one of the most important phenomena, technological, economic phenomena happening right now these days, which is dematerialization, which is simply satisfying our desires to consume, satisfying our wants and needs, while using fewer resources, fewer materials from the earth. We have not given up our desires to take pictures, watch videos, communicate with each other, do computation. Our desires for that stuff keep growing. We are now doing them with one device instead of 13. And I don't really print out film anymore. I can't remember the last film picture that I took. I don't print out a map when I need to go somewhere. So our use of media is also decreasing thanks to things like the smartphone. When you start to become aware of the phenomenon of dematerialization, you start to spot it all over the economy in all kinds of different industries. Cars now are simultaneously lighter, faster, and more fuel efficient than they used to be. Car engines are about 40% lighter for the same horsepower for better fuel efficiency than they were a generation or two ago. When I was in the early stages of working on this book, I had dinner with a friend of mine who's had a long career. And I was trying to describe this phenomenon of dematerialization to him. He said, "Oh, I got a great example." I said, "Tell me." And he said, "When I started my career in 1968, I went to work for the Chicago and Northwest Railway. And they immediately put me on a team, and the team's job was to figure out where our boxcars were in the country." I said, "What?" He said, "The lore in the industry at that time was that about 5% of our boxcars moved on any given day. And it wasn't that the other 95% needed to rest. It was that we didn't know where they were." You have thousands of miles of track. You have all these freight yards all over the country. You have no real-time tracking. You have no auditing. Nobody's got a great record of what's going on. And so he said, we literally didn't know where these 30-ton pieces of metal were all across this great country of ours. He said, "My job was to help us do a better job of tracking this inventory. And one thing they did was they would employ people called spotters to stand at railroad crossings all day and watch for one of their own boxcars to go by. And when they saw one, they would telephone or telegraph back to headquarters and say, gang, I spotted one out there in the field." The reason these boxcars have those markings on them is not so that all of us who have train spotting as a hobby have an easier time of it. It's to help the company know where its inventory is. And so my friend said, obviously, as the team went on, we started to hear about these crazy things around 1970 called the computer and the database that might help us with some of these tasks. And by now, obviously, every boxcar in the country has all kinds of sensors on it. There's RFID on the side of the track. There are millions of EDI messages that go around the industry every day. I'm pretty sure every railroad in America knows where every piece of these 30-ton items of inventory is across the country. So when you have that knowledge, you don't need as many of these pieces of metal. My friend said it was clear to us in 1968 that if we could take that 5% up to 10%, we would need half as many boxcars. It's a massive material savings. So these things are happening all over the economy. And they've really got us out of worrying about this phenomenon that we're going to run out of resources because we have this fantastic combination. We have nasty market competition so that you can't just pass on your increased costs to your customers. Monopolists can do that. Companies locked in competition can't. And then capitalism, the profit motive, provides all the incentive you need, not just to grow your top line, but to shrink your bottom line. A penny saved is a penny earned. And the computer revolution, this unfolding digital revolution that we're all so excited about, just keeps offering more and more opportunities to swap out an atom, swap in a bit or a few, and realize some material savings out there in the world. So I think in America, we're probably already at peak stuff or going past it. And I predict that phenomenon is going to spread around the world pretty quickly as this 1-2 punch of market-based competition and extremely powerful digital technologies spreads around the world. There's one more problem that we should talk about, and in a sense, it's about the bad side effects of this intense economy that we've built. The third problem that came up, and again, this was around the time of Earth Day, was that we were going to pollute the world so much that it could become a very unpleasant place to live or an uninhabitable one, and we might wipe out a lot of the animals that we shared the planet with. These were not crazy worries at all in 1970. This is what had been happening to pollution levels in the country leading up to 1970. Those of us who are too young to remember when there were smog alerts and air quality alerts on the radio every morning, there was this thing called the radio that a lot of us actually participated in. But back around 1970, it was common to hear about how bad the air was in major American cities. This is the passenger pigeon. In 1815, John Audubon, the famous naturalist, saw a flock of passenger pigeons go overhead that took 3 days to pass and that was thick enough to blot out the sun. A century later, they were all gone. We wiped this bird out. The last one died in a Cincinnati zoo in 1914. So our voracious industrial era appetites were bad news for a lot of the animals that we shared the planet with, including the biggest one that has ever lived on planet Earth, the blue whale. I didn't realize this. I thought that whales had their worst time during the 19th century Moby Dick harpoon era of whaling. That's actually not right. They got in real trouble in the 20th century when we invented rocket-propelled harpoons and ships that were giant carving boards and things like that. We went after the biggest animals ever to have lived on planet Earth. And if there were this many of them all throughout the world's southern oceans in 1970, there were this many of them by about 1970. As far as we can tell, we took the total population of blue whales down to fewer than 1,000 individual animals. So the great triumph, to me, the great triumph and the thing we should be intensely grateful to Earth Day and to the environmental movement for, was saying, we have to stop this. We're not going to put up with it anymore. We took to the streets. We demanded cleaner air, cleaner water, cleaner land, and we demanded that we ease up on the animals that we share the Earth with. And, especially in the democratic, rich world, our governments listened to us. And we put in place regulation that was actually strict and has actually been enforced in the decades since Earth Day. And the turnaround has been nothing short of remarkable. Here's air quality and economic growth leading up to 1970. Here's air quality and economic growth in the years since 1970. Our air is more than 90% cleaner. It's still not clean enough, but our air is more than 90% cleaner than it was at the time of Earth Day. This is an amazing triumph, an amazing benefit for our health. We worry these days about global warming, and we should be worried about it. It's real, it's bad, and we're not doing enough to stop it. But for me, helping to think about the right approaches becomes a lot easier once I realize that greenhouse gases are air pollution. I don't say that to minimize the problem. I say it to categorize the problem. We have made amazing progress with other bad varieties of air pollution. This is an addressable problem. It's not going to be easy. It's not going to be quick. We don't have the political will as of right now, but we for sure have the toolkit if we got serious about this. In January of this year, a bunch of fancy economists published an open letter in the Wall Street Journal calling for one of the most effective policy tools for dealing with global warming, which is a carbon tax or a carbon dividend. And the idea here is extremely simple. If pollution is bad and it's currently free to pollute, make it expensive. Put a price tag on it. Put a tax on it. If you do that, businesses will run from increased costs like gazelles run when they smell a lion. The response will be just immediate to it. Those of us who have economist friends know they agree. If you have two economist friends, God help you, and you know that they agree on nothing, right? Economists will argue about which direction the sun rises in the morning, except on this issue. I've never seen anything like this before. More than 3,500 economists, left, right, center, doesn't matter, have signed up on this letter to say this is the biggest policy no-brainer that we can think of today. We are not doing it in most places around the world. It's not easy to do. That's not the point. But what's the answer for dealing with global warming? What's in the economics toolkit? What's in the policy toolkit? It's a complete no-brainer. Let's go back and look at our whales. We left them in this state. There are about 500 of them left in the southern oceans. They're coming back. They are not all the way back by any stretch, but their numbers are much, much bigger, and they're on the right trajectory here. One phrase I learned from Stuart Brand a little while ago is, nature bats last. I love that, right? If we can just get out of the way, if we can leave the playing field, just get out, give the land back to nature, set up a park, set up a marine park, don't mess with it. Nature will bat last. Nature can and does come back over and over again. I find that incredibly optimistic. I want to wind up with another pair of forces. We talked about what happens when we bring computers and capitalism together. They won't solve by themselves the problems of pollution and species lost. To deal with those problems, we need two more forces. We need us to demand action, to become aware of the problem and demand a solution to it, and we need our governments to listen to us. It's hard to believe in these dark days in some ways. Both of these are actually on the upward trend in most places around the world. People are demanding action, and governments in general, there are exceptions, are getting more responsive over time, not less. So I'm cautiously optimistic. I get a lot happier when I look at some of the trends that have been going on in areas that we should care a lot about. So I want to give you a guided tour of some great things that have been happening because we've got all four of these forces. I call them the four horsemen of the optimist. We've got capitalism, tech progress, public awareness, and responsive government working together. Let's look at what's been happening around the world. The first thing is, this is not the percentage of poor people in the world, desperately poor people. This is the absolute number of extremely poor people in the world today. It has never been going down so quickly before in our history. There are fewer desperately poor people now than there were 200 years ago. This is an unambiguous triumph for us. People see that graph and think, okay, fine, that's great, but it's just China. It's not just China. China's a huge part of it. Every region in the world is lowering its poverty rates. Every region in the world is increasing the number of years that the average child has in school. Every region in the world is increasing its life expectancy. Even Southern Africa, which went through that terrifying AIDS crisis, is now past it, and life expectancy there is at an all-time high. The last graph I want to show you is just one of the most amazing and optimistic things I've seen in a long time. This is what's been happening to maternal and child mortality all around the world, richest countries down to lowest income countries. They've all been getting better. And we talk about inequality for good reasons. There's a lot of important conversation we need to have about global inequality. In these areas, in access to services and health outcomes, inequality has been collapsing. The poorest countries in the world are so much closer than they've ever been to the high-income countries around the world. So I see enough data like this, and I start to think this is kind of a stupid question. The evidence to me is overwhelming. We can solve our big problems. Again, right now, we're not doing a great job with the 21st century's huge problem of global warming. That doesn't mean we can't solve it. The playbook is actually pretty good. I want to wrap up before we have time for some questions. I want to wrap up with it's shameless pandering to the audience, but it's not Photoshop. This is an actual picture of what happens when we clean up the water, get out of the way, let nature come back, let nature bat last. We're here in New York City. You know who else is here in New York City once in a while? Humpback whales can now be seen off the coast of New York City. How's that for a good note to end on? Thank you. All right, we have magic questions here. All this, and yet the globe is getting warmer. Are you concerned about that? Did I not say that enough times? How do we reconcile the good news you presented about the environment with the narrative of bad news? The narrative about bad news with global warming is a correct narrative as far as I can tell. I'm not a climate scientist, but I think they've been doing a pretty good job of building accurate models, and when they run them forward, we continue to see warming. My favorite way to think about this problem comes from William Nordhaus, who won the Nobel Prize last year, in large part for his work about climate and how to mitigate it. And a couple other economists who also had what I think is a really clever way to look at this. What Nordhaus and Marty Weitzman said was, look, the range of outcomes here, climate outcomes, economic outcomes, is huge. We don't have great certainty. We have a huge range of possible outcomes over the course of the 21st century. And one reaction to that is, oh, great, we got a range of outcomes. That means things could be fine. We don't need to worry. And what Nordhaus said is that's exactly the wrong way to look at it. Because the tail risk, the risk over on this side, the bad side, is big. It's not trivial. It's not 0.001%. It feels like it's a lot closer to 10 or 15% of a catastrophically bad outcome here. And when you think about it that way, the urgency just becomes higher. Because if somebody said to me, hey, you're going on a trip, I might say, great, I like to travel. But if they said there's a 10 or 15% chance that you will die or be maimed, I would do everything in my power not to go on that trip. So the right way to think about global warming is this is a trip we do not want those outcomes to happen. We need to summon our policy and our technological and our environmental and our economic toolkit and take this range out of the feasible set of outcomes here. Did I beat that horse enough? Can we move on from climate? Not letting me off easy here, are you? How do you feel about the Green New Deal and its approach for a healthier planet? Too aggressive, not enough. The Green New Deal is many things. And it strikes me as what we do in American politics, where we have a bill and we stick all kinds of stuff in it that we want. And we put a great title on it, like a Green New Deal. The Green New Deal has some aspects of dealing with global warming, and then things like a guaranteed job and a high minimum wage and stuff like that. That's irrelevant for the issue of actually dealing with the planet. What I want is a candidate out there who will embrace a carbon tax, which is the single biggest no-brainer on the policy front, and embrace nuclear power, which is the single biggest no-brainer on the energy and on the technology front. One thing I talk about a bit in the book is nuclear power safety record. And most of us have an ick reaction to nuclear because we remember some combination of 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl and Fukushima. The evidence on this is overwhelming. Nuclear is by far the safest source of power out there. So we have one power source on the planet that is very clean, very potent, very scalable, not intermittent, and very safe, and yet our ick factor is dominating the discussion, and in many parts of the world, people are trying to turn away from the nuclear they already have, let alone build more. I find that ridiculous. My Green New Deal would have those two things in it, and everything else is second or third order in my view. This is a great question. How sustainable? Whenever anybody says blank, blank, complex, you know they don't mean it as a compliment, right? How sustainable is the industrial food complex and its reliance on monocultures in the field and use of chemicals? As we saw, use of chemicals is actually going down. Pesticide use is flat or going down. Fertilizer use is actually going down. Monocultures we should be clear, a lot of the cropland in America is a monoculture. We grow wheat or we grow corn. If that were not sustainable, it's hard for me to understand how the Great Plains states and the Midwestern states that turn out all that produce could be doing it for well over a century and their yields keep going up. I start to lose sight of what the word sustainable means because I think we have a very clear track record of sustainability here. Sometimes for me, sustainability becomes a synonym for stuff I don't like. And I think that's a poor equivalence. So food should be grown where food grows best. Food should be grown in the most productive, intensive way possible. And the research is fairly clear that organic farming, for example, is not any better for the planet, and in some ways, like carbon, worse for the planet than conventional agricultural practices. I have much less of a problem with our current industrial food complex than a lot of other people pretty clearly do. We have to stop. Thank you very much.